Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share unnerving dogman encounters I came across on the internet, with two dating back to the 60s and 70s. These stories include something looking through the window of a home at two boys, a man who is clearly distraught after encountering a creature in the park with his sons, and an excerpt from a book detailing the mysterious things that followed investigators home from Skinwalker Ranch, including wolf-like creatures. But first, we start with two encounters with a dogman on the same night in Canada. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who relays two encounters his family members had with a creature on the same night. These stories, as told to the original poster or OP by his uncle, took place almost 50 years ago. He posted the accounts 3 years ago, which by my estimation puts these stories in the early 70s. Even though it happened so long ago, the OP's uncle still clearly remembers the circumstances surrounding the events that took place that night. The OP does not say where exactly these stories take place, just that his uncle lived in southwest Ontario, Canada. The OP's grandparents lived in a farmhouse that was the last house on a dead-end road. They lived in what he describes as a small community that consisted of 8 or 9 homes. The road these homes sat on ran out and met another road, creating a T intersection. If you turned right at the intersection, the road would lead you over some train tracks, down through a ravine, and out to a main country road. Going left would take you through open fields until you got to a 90-degree curve that led to a second country road ending in another ravine on the left side of the road. The grandfather had started a family band that consisted of the OP's mom, uncle, and 2 cousins. The night the events took place, they had gotten together to rehearse, which ended at around 11 or 11:30 p.m. When they were done with their practice, the OP's cousin and uncle broke down the uncle's equipment, while the grandfather went out to tend to the animals. He notes that the animals were restless and on edge that night, but the grandfather thought nothing of it as they routinely had a pack of wild dogs pass through the area. When the cousin headed home, his route would take him to the left at the T intersection, leading to his encounter that no one knew about for 3 more days. The uncle's route home would have him turn right at the T intersection following the road to the previously mentioned main country road. He would leave 10 minutes after the cousin. There was either a full moon or very close to it that night because the uncle told the OP that it was bright out. After taking the ride off the road where the grandparents lived, the uncle continued over the tracks, drove through the ravine, and came to a stop sign. As he pulled to a stop, something to his right drew his attention. He briefly saw something large and tall standing in a hunched-over position in the field. It was staring directly at him. As he pulled up to the stop sign, he had to look over his shoulder, then, having angled his car to turn left into his rearview mirror to see the creature. He sat at the stop sign watching this thing for a few seconds that felt more like hours when the creature took off, sprinting toward the car. The uncle sat dumbfounded in a trance-like state, just watching this thing in disbelief. By the time he had snapped out of his trance and gunned it, the dogman had crossed the 400 to 500 yard field from the tree line in a matter of seconds and was so close to the car it was lit up by the brake lights. It was reaching out for the car as it took off. The creature was running on 2 legs the entire time. The uncle describes it as having dark, either brown or black fur, a muzzle similar to that of a dog, pointed ears on top of its head, and eyes that glowed yellowish orange. The uncle says he distinctly remembers that this thing was not looking at the car, but instead at him inside the car. He raced home and called the OP's grandfather, telling him to lock all the doors and to stay inside. When the grandfather asked why, he told him he had seen something in a field and isn't sure what it was. That he should lock up just to be safe. It was the only time he saw the creature or anything like it. A few days after his encounter, the uncle was sitting outside with the OP's cousin having a smoke. The uncle told the cousin what he saw, expecting to either be made fun of or called crazy. However, the cousin told him he saw something that night on the way home too. As he was coming to a stop, something ran across the road in front of him, causing him to slam on brakes and skid to a stop while almost going off the road. He only got a brief look at the thing, but says it looked like a huge dog or wolf running upright on its hind legs. He does say it could have been the way the creature just jumped across the road in front of his car that made it look like it was running on its hind legs, but he described it, according to the OP, pretty much the same exact way his uncle did when he saw the thing. To give a good idea of just how fast this thing was, the cousin was about 2 miles from where the uncle had his encounter. Between the two spots were dense wooded areas and a ravine that had semi-steep sides. Around that time, there were reports of strange noises such as growling, howling, and barking in the woods and around some of the farms, and some livestock that turned up dead and partially eaten. Everyone in the area chalked it up to the pack of wild dogs, but the OP's uncle and cousin think it was something else. I'm going to be honest, if I was driving at night and I looked over and saw something like that, I wouldn't even bother stopping at the stop sign. I would just hit the gas and keep going. But in all seriousness, the uncle does talk about being in a trance-like state while looking at this creature. There have been stories where these beings seem to be able to mess with our heads, so I'm not sure if that's what was going on here or if he was just in shock. But the freakiest part about this story to me is when the uncle said it was like the dog was focusing on him inside the car and not the car itself. This, at least to me, points to this thing having malicious intent. Why would it charge the car if it didn't? If it was across the field and wanted nothing to do with the OP, it could have turned and disappeared into the forest it came out of. Another thing that came to mind was, why did it pass up the cousin and not try to attack him but charged at the uncle? I'm thinking maybe because the uncle stopped and sat there looking at it when the cousin didn't really get a good look at this thing and kept going. These creatures seem to know when they are being watched just like we do, and perhaps it took exception to the uncle sitting there watching it. I'm just glad he snapped out of his trance before it was too late and was able to outrun this thing. What do you think? Would you stop and try to get a better look at a creature like that if you saw it while driving at night? The next story of this episode happened around the same time period as the first, detailing an encounter in western Pennsylvania in 1965. This story takes place in the mountain range right outside of Cresson, Pennsylvania. Cresson is a borough located in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, and sits 80 miles or 130 kilometers east of Pittsburgh. It covers a total area of 3,163 square miles and has a population of 1,711 as of the 2010 census. The original poster was 7 years old and out exploring the woods with his friend who lived nearby. After crossing a stream at the bottom of a ravine, the boys ventured up a hill and walked about a mile before coming to a peculiar sight. Amongst the trees were interlaced branches creating a dome. The entrance was tall enough that the OP could walk through standing at his full height, which is exactly what he did. He says it smelled terrible inside. Once inside, he and his friends saw what looked like a pallet made of timothy grass on one end of the makeshift shelter and small bones and sticks on the ground. However, there was nothing in there that suggested the dwelling belonged to a human. Unable to stand the stench any longer, the boys made their way back out only to be struck with the feeling that they were being watched from up the slope. Dusk had begun settling over the mountains, so the boys made a quick exit and told the friend's father what they came across when they got back to his house. His father told them they had come across a hobo shelter and nothing more. The OP says they found many shelters like the one they found that day, and no, it did not belong to a human. After coming across the dwelling, they saw a shadow moving amongst the trees in what appeared to be eye glint. But the reflection off the eyes was dismissed as the glasses of someone lurking about. The OP says that whatever was out there felt more animalistic to him though. Fast forward to one Saturday morning when the OP was once again out at his friend's house. But instead of wandering around the woods, which they preferred to being in town where the OP lived, the boys were inside laying on the living room floor watching a horror movie he believes was Dementia 13. He says it was hard to follow plot-wise, but was intense in some moments, providing jump scares and spooky images. It was while they were watching the movie that they heard a thump on the front door. They looked over to see a dog's face looking at them through the middle window of 3 set at the top of the door. The OP says whatever this thing was had to be at least 6 or 7 feet tall just to look through those windows. Its eyes glinted in the light and the boys screamed, thinking it was a werewolf. The face disappeared as they gaped at it, dropping below the door's windows. The boys nervously made their way to one of the walls in the living room that mostly consisted of a picture window and looked out to see if they could see this creature. In the midst of the fog, they could see it moving away, looking like nothing more than a shadow. It was walking upright on its hind legs, which the OP describes as hop walking with its forelegs out in front of it. This sent a surge of fear through them, adding to what they were already feeling after discovering they were being watched. When this creature disappeared into the tree line, the boys decided that's what lived in the dome-like shelter they discovered a while back. It seemed like the best explanation to them. Also, they decided not to tell his parents, being that they didn't want to be ridiculed again. From that day forward, they were very careful in those woods. Years later, the OP heard about the Ohio Grassman, a Sasquatch being in the area. The dome-like shelter they found that day was definitely in his territory, but he later heard about another creature in western Pennsylvania that matched what he and his friends saw watching them through the window years earlier when they were children. And it was something people were calling a dogman. He ends his post by saying he's glad they never came face to face with the dogman, but does wish he had seen it a little more clearly as it walked away from his friend's house. He still gets chills thinking about being on that mountain at dusk with a creature such as that, and also ponders what could have happened if that thing had tried to come through the front door. Just like in so many stories, especially before people started calling this cryptid a dogman, the OP and his friend thought they were looking at a werewolf. Another thing I hear a lot about not just these creatures, but all cryptids, is the smell he describes inside the dome-like shelter. I've often heard stories, especially dogman stories, where these creatures like to look into the windows of homes. They seem to be very curious with humans and our dwellings. Or perhaps since the OP and his friend went into the dogman's home, the creatures just thought to return the favor by showing up at his friend's house unannounced. I believe though that perhaps he was just interested in seeing who it was that went into his home. Maybe it left them be at the house because it didn't see them as a threat. But what would that be like, looking up at the window set in the door to see a dog's face looking into your home, especially on a foggy day while watching horror movies? And for it to look like a werewolf? I'd imagine it gave them quite a scare. If it was me, I would have stayed out of those woods from that point on. It's always interesting to me how sometimes these cryptids don't bother people who go into the woods even after the people see them, and other times they chase them out as if guarding their territory. I'm guessing when the OP said they were more careful in the woods, he meant they left this thing and its home be from that point on. Maybe in doing so they stayed out of its territory, and in turn it stayed away from the friend's home. Just some thoughts that came to my mind while reading this one. What do you think about this one? And what would you do if you looked up and saw a dogman looking through the window on your front door? The next story comes from a poster who was clearly distraught after encountering a creature straight out of a nightmare while visiting a park close to his home with his 2 young sons. His encounter took place at Rock State Park in Harford County, Maryland in October of 2021. The original poster begins his post by saying that this was his 3rd attempt to try and tell his story, but the first 2 times he convinced himself it was dumb to try and post it. He still, even after going through the traumatic event, could not believe what he saw. He references the cascade effect of such an encounter and says every day after, his view of the world was spun like a top. Some days are normal and some days are not. So clearly what happened to the OP that day had a profound impact on him. The day the encounter took place, the OP had taken his 7-year-old and 2.5-year-old sons to a state park close to his home. He describes the park, which was 1.5 miles away from his home, as only having 4 parking spots and has a trail that is 1/2 mile long following alongside a creek. The trail comes to an end when the creek forks, creating a beachhead that covers approximately 20 feet. He says 6 people in the small area would make it crowded. The OP and his sons go for a hike each week, and the Rock State Park is one of the 3 in their rotation, so his sons are very familiar with it. The park's trail is a moderate hike that has inclines, natural obstacles, and narrow areas due to the lack of maintenance, according to the OP. During their hike on this day, his oldest son was about 30 to 50 feet ahead of him as he walked alongside his youngest son. This is nothing new and just another normal hike for the father and his sons, with his oldest reaching the beachhead before the OP and his youngest, but they soon joined him by the creek, where the 2 boys proceeded to start throwing rocks into the water. His youngest son was to his left and his oldest was about 10 to 15 feet to his right. Everything was fine until the OP bent down to cuff his pant leg. That's when he heard a blood-curdling scream erupt from his oldest son. He looked over to see him falling backwards, screaming and wildly kicking his legs. He followed his son's eyes to see, in his words, an animal he could not understand, perched on a flat rock on the other side of the creek no farther than 20 to 25 feet away. He describes the creature as being so large it looked like it could have jumped across the creek in one stride had it wanted to. It was barrel-chested and had very defined pectoral muscles, shoulders, and biceps that looked no different than a human man. They were just much larger. Its face resembled a hyena with a stubby snout and bulging eyes, according to the OP. He says the way it was squatting down on the rock looked more like the starting position for a sprinter ready to race instead of being down on all fours like a normal animal. Its thighs and hind end were very large and noticeable. In fact, he describes the mass as being unnatural. It had front-facing ears and tufts of hair on the sides and top of its head and looked to be on high alert judging by its face. The OP likens it to when a dog has quick head movements in anticipation of a ball being thrown. Except this creature's head was snapping back and forth with its gaze switching from the OP's son, who was still screaming as he fell backward on the trail and started running, to the OP, who was scooping up his younger son and trying to get between the creature and his oldest. He says the dogman looked to either be ready to lunge forward or retreat based on how it was positioned. When the OP got between his son and this nightmarish creature, they were on the trail and out of this thing's sight. He says this is when things got even more bizarre. He yelled at his oldest son to run, which he would do, sprinting back down the trail while crying and screaming. But after about 30 feet, the OP says he would turn around as if completely dazed and not knowing what was going on. The OP would once again yell at him to keep running, so the son would repeat what he just did. Run, screaming and crying, then stopping again in a daze. This happened 3 times on their way back down the trail. The father doesn't know whether to chalk it up to shock, fear, or something else. Luckily though, the dogman did not follow them when they ran away. The OP says he would not wish what he felt during this ordeal on his enemies, as it was the only time where he knew he would not be able to protect his sons. He knew the buck knife he had on his hip would have been useless against the creature should it have decided to attack. The worst thought of all was when he thought he might have to tell his older son to take his younger brother's hand and lead him back to the car as fast as he could. He says this thought left a scar in his mind deeper than seeing this unexplainable creature. He ends his post by saying there was no mistaking what he saw that day, but trying to explain it to anyone would be futile, and that his mind is trying to force itself to debunk what he witnessed. However, he does say his focus was crystal clear in that moment, as his son's safety was the most important thing to him. He would keep them safe at all costs. He remained laser focused on his surroundings and what was in it, and did not allow his emotions to overcome him and distort or misinterpret anything about the events of that day. This also includes the creature he saw. In response to a comment, the OP says his oldest son is afraid to go in the yard at night, but the youngest didn't really know what was going on during the encounter. The youngest son was actually laughing when they were running back down the trail because he thought they were just chasing his older brother. The OP doesn't think he understood what was really going on that day or that he was aware of the creature there. His oldest, though, does not even like turning right out of the driveway anymore, which is the direction that leads to the park. The response I saw from the OP that really caught my attention and let me know how much this affected him was when he asked a commenter who said they also encountered a dogman if the pit in his stomach would ever go away. In a lot of these stories, the encounters with these creatures have a profound impact on the people involved, and they sometimes develop PTSD afterward. The fact that the OP's view of the world and reality has been vastly altered, and his question in the comments all point to this. His son was also deeply affected by what he saw, and rightfully so. I feel bad for the OP, but no child should ever have to go through an ordeal like that. It's hard enough for adults to comprehend seeing a creature straight out of legend and myth. Another thing that caught my attention about this one is how the son kept seeming to fall into a trance after screaming, crying, and running for a bit. I mentioned in the first story how these things are said to be able to mess with our heads. Perhaps this creature had something to do with it, or maybe the poor son was just in shock. The way the OP describes the creature snapping his head back and forth makes me think it was just as surprised to see him and his sons as they were to see it. The fact that it didn't chase them back down the trail makes me think it wasn't hunting, but was just coming down for some water. Or perhaps it did see prey in his son and was looking to see what the father would do in response. However, the father does say that the creature looked like it was in a position ready to either lunge or retreat. But then again, as I mentioned, it didn't chase them, so who knows for sure. In any case, I'm just glad the OP and his sons were able to get out of there without further incident. What would you do if you looked across a creek in a park and saw something like that watching you? The final story of this episode is a little bit different from what I normally do, but it was so intriguing that I had to include it in this episode. While searching for other Dogman stories, I came across a post that had an excerpt from a book titled Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, an insider's account of the Secret Government UFO Program. The official description of the book reads as follows. Skinwalkers at the Pentagon unmasked the massive scope of the Pentagon's landmark UFO study that ran from the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C. The Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or AAWSAP, investigated the, quote, Tic Tac and other, quote, nuts and bolts UFO events, analyzed intrusions of UFOs onto U.S. military bases, as well as probed the plethora of bizarre phenomena that government investigators encountered on Skinwalker Ranch. But what caught my eye in the description of the book and what led to the post I found and me wanting to include the excerpts in this episode reads as follows. Encountering UFOs often lead to the attachment of strange phenomena to military personnel who visited the ranch and brought something home to their families, resulting in frightening eruptions of paranormal events in their households that terrorized and sometimes injured their children. So the agents who investigated Skinwalker Ranch all had things follow them back to their homes. This is the hitchhiker effect. And what being was mostly seen by the families of these agents? You guessed it, dogmen. Or as the book describes them, huge wolf-like creatures walking upright on two legs. The agents' families also reported seeing black humanoid shapes in their homes, hearing noises and footsteps, and seeing blue orbs. This would go on for months and/or years following the agents' return from Skinwalker Ranch. While this is all fascinating, I will stick to the parts of the book posted that included the wolf-like creatures. The account follows one family in particular living in Virginia. The agent's name is Jonathan Axelrod. The excerpts pick up after his wife has seen a black humanoid shape walking toward her while in bed, hearing footsteps coming up the stairs when everyone was in bed asleep, noises coming from the kitchen, and his son seeing blue orbs in his bedroom one night. The following excerpts come from Chapter 1. Later, an even more bizarre event with strong links to the Skinwalker Ranch erupted in the Axelrod home. Again, Jonathan was out of town on a work assignment. It was after midnight, and Ruth, Axelrod's wife, had turned off all the lights in the kitchen and was preparing to go upstairs when her eye caught a movement out in the yard. She walked over to the window for a better look, then froze as she witnessed one of the most bizarre sights she had ever beheld. Standing upright and leaning against one of the trees at the perimeter of her yard was a huge wolf-like creature. She saw the creature plainly in the dim night light. It had long hair and looked like a wolf, but it was standing on two legs. Ruth stood paralyzed, feeling both confusion and a kind of dread. The creature appeared to be staring right at her. Its gaze was not friendly. She continued to stare at this eerie sight, trying to fathom the impossibility of an upright wolf-like creature in a quiet, upper-middle-class suburban Virginian neighborhood. The creature then took one last look at her, turned, and walked slowly on two legs further into the tree line. Within minutes, she had lost sight of it. She stood there a long time trying to determine if she had just had a very intense hallucination or if her mind was beginning to go. The scene had been so bizarre and frightening she decided not to call her husband or to tell her kids. The kids were stable and well adjusted, but Ruth had noticed that they were on edge from the unexplained events that had happened in their household. Ruth went to bed and tried to put the surreal vision out of her mind. 3 days later, at about 10:30 on a bright Saturday morning, the two teenage Axelrod sons were downstairs in the living room. When Paul got up to stretch his legs, a movement in the yard caught his eye, and he gasped in astonishment at the sight of a huge wolf-like creature standing on two legs in the backyard staring straight at him. Alerted by the brothers' gasp, Michael jumped up and saw the 7-foot-tall wolf gazing menacingly at them. The animal appeared to be completely comfortable standing on two legs. Both Axelrod boys felt a sense of fear. Suddenly, the beast took off running towards the tree line, its long brown, black hair blowing in the rapid movement. The beast ran easily and fluidly on its hind legs, with long strides seemingly impossible for normal canine anatomy. Both boys stood in silence as the wolf was soon lost in the trees that bordered the Axelrod property. The thick, insulated windows had prevented them from hearing any sound from the beast's transit across their yard. A couple of hours later, when Ruth came back, the boys breathlessly told their mother about the event. Ruth felt a deep chill as they excitedly described in detail an apparition identical to what she had seen a few nights previously, and that she was still hoping was a hallucination. That concludes the excerpts from the book I will read, but it isn't the end of the story. Axelrod goes on to talk about how the, quote, high strangeness that followed him back from Skinwalker Ranch spread throughout the area, with old high school friends telling him they had seen a large wolf-like creature. There are theories suggesting that cryptids, UFOs, aliens, and paranormal activity are all connected. All of these and more have been reported at Skinwalker Ranch. But for not just one of these things, but all of them to follow these agents home after they investigated Skinwalker Ranch not only adds credence to that theory, but also to the hitchhiker effect. This is where these beings attach themselves to you and follow you home. This is exactly what happened to these agents, and their families are the ones who had to deal with all of it. No one was injured at the Axelrod home, so it would seem like they just wanted to send a message. That, or they wanted to torment and or punish them for their father and husband impeding on their territory at Skinwalker Ranch. This is a good example for why I always say investigating or going back to where you had an encounter to further investigate these beings is not a good idea. You could be unintentionally inviting this kind of stuff into your life. And not just you, but your family and even friends who live in the area, like what this book talks about. That's why I knew I had to include this in an episode when I came across it. What do you think about this one? Does it make you want to go out and investigate the unknown? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.